Hello and welcome to the next episode of Learn With Me Hydrasynth. This is episode 19, Sound Design, Modwheel, Keys. So first, what is Learn With Me? Well, Learn With Me is currently two series where I take you through my end-to-end process of learning to get the best out of a synthesizer, in this case, the ASM Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. This is a shrunk-down version of the original Hydrasynth, which instead of having 49 full-size keys, has 37 mini keys, which retain the polyphonic aftertouch, and instead of having 8 encoders, buttons, and a corresponding screen, it only has 4, and it lacks a ribbon controller. So far, we've talked through all the major sections of the synthesizer, and we've explored the entire synthesis path, as well as some of the other features. And last episode, we began starting to do some sound design. So last episode's sound design was a pad, and it was a pad using aftertouch, specifically polyphonic aftertouch, as an expression. It was as much as anything to demonstrate an end-to-end process and how I work with this synthesizer. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to make a keys sort of sound, not designed to sound like an acoustic instrument, just the synth keys. And I'm going to use and provide an expression for the Modwheel. So that's how we're going to get variation in timbre, in addition to typical keys expression, which would be velocity sensitivity. So let's get in a knit patch and let's get going. I thought a little bit about what I might want to do here, and the first thing I thought was I would like to use a relatively soft tone, so as I can come up with ways to add more timbre to it. So I'm going to use the tri-saw wave, and I might be using the sub, I'm not sure, but I'm going to set that to triangle. And I'm planning, at least initially, on using oscillators 1 and 2. One thing worth noting is it's possible, if you turn all the things in the oscillator section up, to have a signal which is quite loud coming in, and you can clip later parts of the signal path. I'm going to leave those at 100 for now, just to try and minimize that risk. I'm also going to separate these oscillators to start getting us a bit of a stereo image right away. So I'm going to pan them out, plus minus 32. 64 is the full value these will go to. So I'm also thinking that I want some movement going on here, and I'm probably going to do what I did for the pad sound, which seems a bit odd because this is going to be quite a different sound, but I think it works. But for the pad sound, I had a relatively slow movement. For this, I'm going to have a relatively fast movement, so the timbre and the tone is going to be quite different. But I'm still going to use the pulse width modulation squeeze parameter. I'm going to have a quick listen to how this sounds so I can set a base value. Oops, turn that up. Okay, so I'm going to run it at about 32. I'm going to do the same thing here, because they're going to have the same waveform going into them. So if I like it once, I'll like it twice. And now I'm going to modulate it with LFO 5, but I've already decided I want this to go quite a bit faster, so I'm going to set it about 5 Hertz. So for both of them, I'm going to be modulating the depth. And that number there is 32. So if I modulated 32, it's going to go plus minus. I could think about it, but what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm just going to go and set it and see how it sounds. So I just want to keep it away from that buzz, so I'm going to try and get it to this plus minus. It's a little bit strong though. I'm going to dial them back to about 5.5. Remember that I'm going to make this into a sort of plucky sound. So this shape isn't going to be too, this motion here is going to be suppressed as the tail comes in. So what makes a pluck? Well, when I'm thinking of a pluck here, I'm thinking that I want something similar to how a piano envelopes. So what that means is if we hold the key down, we have a relatively long tail. If we press a key quickly, we're going to get a little bit more velocity or less velocity, so a little bit louder, a slight timbre shift. The timbre shift, I'm sure, is going to come from the filter to some extent, but most importantly is the amplitude shape. So let's get straight on with envelope 2. So for a keys sound, I'm expecting it to decay to 0 and release to 0. So I'm going to immediately set sustain to 0. And I probably want the decay phase to be potentially quite long. So if I choose to hold the key for a long time, I have a sound which lasts quite long. Let's see what a 1 second release sounds like. 3 seconds. I think that's working, but I think I'm going to fine-tune this a little more by adjusting the curves of the envelope phases. So the way that I can set the curves here is for the decay phase, if I go all the way in the logarithmic direction, it's going to stay loud until the end when it's going to dip. If I put it all the way the other way, it's going to dip very fast. So I think something is happening, like a phasing sort of artifact, because these things are exactly in tune. So what I'm going to use is some of this analog drift feature. So that's going to detune the oscillators and adjust the enveloping parameters and things in the signal flow so they don't match exactly. While I'm at it, I'm probably going to turn on warm mode, because I think the keys should be a sort of warm sound. It's going to take a bit of brightness off, boost the low end. And I'm going to turn on random phase again because I'm not looking to get this phasing happening. So the next thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to have some filter movement going on here. So first let me set the bass position for filter 1 to where I want it. I'll turn some resonance up just so I can hear it. So you can hear that I've taken a lot of the high end off of there. Maybe let's go for this one. So what I'd like, I think, is to start with the envelope 2 shape on envelope 1. So to do that, hold save, press envelope 2, press envelope 1, release. So now envelope 1 is set up like envelope 2. This is going to be more of an initial timbre thing. So what I'll do, I think, is probably halve the length of this envelope, roughly. Well, let's half the decay, 3/4 of the release. And now let's bring this in. So let's get some velocity sensitivity on the overall amplitude and some velocity sensitivity on the filter. Quite like it. I think I might also like to experiment with filter 2. So filter 2, and by default it's serially routed, so one of them is routed after the other. Filter 2 is also by default set to 0 key tracking. So that means whatever frequency you set it to, irrespective of the key you play, it will stay in the same spot. So this is good if you just want to roll off some low end, but that's not necessarily what you want to do when using these in general. So let's experiment with the filter cutoff. It's sounding okay. I think we've got a reasonable tone going on. It might be interesting to experiment with the ring mod. So what I think I'll do is I'll solo the ring mod, and I'll probably have it modulating, or sorry, the sources being mutant 1 and mutant 3. So okay, I quite like the sound of that. So let's now unsolo that. I'm going to turn down these oscillators and I'm going to bring in with the ring mod just so it's quiet in the background there. Okay, so it turns out that those work at about 100. So let's listen to what the sub sounds like. So I think maybe the sub is something that I'm going to experiment with when we go on to the Modwheel modulations for this. Another thing that might be interesting is some noise. So let's bring in some noise. Let's listen to the types of noise. I quite like the sound of that blue noise. Obviously this is very loud. I think that's sounding pretty good. So let's think of some more velocity expression we can use here. One thing which might be quite nice is it might be nice to have maybe the sub-oscillator come in a little more at higher velocity, and maybe to use some of the drive on filter 1. So let's experiment with that. So let's say velocity is going to map to drive. Let's just turn it up. I think the noise is too punchy at higher velocity, so what I might do then is I might do the opposite, which is, oops, that's not what I meant to do. I might have the velocity negatively impact the noise level. I think that's sounding pretty good. I think it might be interesting to have a bit of stereo motion there. We already have the panning on the oscillators, but I think it might be good to have this. But if I go alternating, it will make them wider by some amount proportional to how many notes that I'm playing. And I'd like this to work with some stereo motion if I just play monophonically. So I'm going to use random motion. I'm just going to listen to it. A bit too wide. Maybe there. I think that's sounding pretty good. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to add some effects to this, and then we're going to circle back around and we're going to figure out how we're going to add some interesting movement and timbre variation using the Modwheel. So effects. Maybe a phaser is going to be good for this. I was just thinking that this LFO5 I set at about 5 Hertz. So I might set this at half the frequency. Obviously this is way overboard now. Now I'm going to turn down the wet dry. It's a bit too strong still. Okay, I like the way that's sounding. Let's go to the delay. I think BPM synth is usually convenient here. I think, okay, let's darken the tone a bit. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to have quite a long feedback tail. A bit of a darker tone in there. Yeah, I like the way they've got that motion from the LFO and from the phaser. I think that's quite a nice combination. And the delay just adds a little bit more motion in there, so that's good. Let's go for a reverb. Maybe 15 milliseconds. The pre-delay is hinting at the room size here. Maybe a bit brighter. Maybe I'm going to take some of that low end out. Now let's wet dry blend. I think maybe the velocity modulation of the drive is a bit excessive, so I'm going to turn that down a bit. Okay, so that was the reverb, and I like the feel that we got for the phaser, so I think I'm going to go for a flanger here. And let's turn that up. And I used the last one about, was it 2.5? So let's have these not quite in sync with one another. Obviously that's very strong sounding at the moment, but I'm gonna Dial it back a bit. Okay, so I'm going to use the mixer to just try and get the timbre a little bit closer to what I'd like. Sounding good, I think. So, in much the same way as I used one of the macros in the pad design to map to aftertouch, I'm going to do something similar here. I find it's more convenient to do it that way because when you're in macro assign, you don't have to pick the source each time, you only have to pick the destination. When you're doing it in the mod matrix, you have to firstly use one slot for each of these modulations, whereas a macro, there's only one mod slot required to modulate up to 8 destinations, and I can map them all to the mod wheel with one action. So let's go straight for that. As I mentioned before, for ones which I'm using for controls rather than to adjust directly, I'm going to start at the end. And first things first, I think I might adjust the wet-dry of the delay versus the reverb. So I'm going to try and adjust the balance between the two of them. So let's get wet-dry for both of them. And what I'm going to do to help me set this is I'm going to turn that to maximum so I can hear what the maximum effect sounds like. So back to macro edit. What I think I'll do is make the reverb more dry and the delay more wet. Pretty nice. So this is controlled by the macro control. Now I'm going to go and set that macro control to be controlled by the mod wheel. So in the mod matrix, take another slot. I'm going to assign the source is going to be mod wheel, but there isn't a shortcut to do that. So I'm going to pick LFO5, go all the way through to mod wheel, to macro assign, and macro number 8. Full level. Go to the macro itself, turn it down. Something I forgot to do. By default, the mod wheel has a special separate LFO which introduces vibrato. I'm going to turn that down to 0. I think I need to make the reverb even quieter. The other thing is I think it's a bit bright with all this additional sound in here. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to bring... Actually, that just made me think of something else. It might be interesting to experiment adjusting the bandwidth of the sound with the velocity. So what I might do is I might have filter 2 be moved down a bit, which is opening it more in response to velocity. Let's see how that sounds. Oops. Filter 2. Cut off. And I want it to be adjusted by velocity. I might close it a bit. Okay, I quite like that. Sorry, that was a little aside there. Let's jump back into it. And I think what I'm going to do is darken the sound a little bit. So I'm going to use the cutoff probably for both filters, and I'm going to move them both down in response to this mod wheel motion. Another thing I might do is bring in some of the sub-oscillator as the mod wheel goes up. So let's try that. Mixer, oscillator 3, volume. Just a little. And maybe also some of the ring mod. So I think another thing I might do is I might actually make it quieter. And the reason that I'm going to do that is I quite like the brightness at the bottom of the mod wheel, so I'll actually want to reverse the sense of the mod wheel. So what I'm going to do then is make the top of the mod wheel quieter, and then I'm going to go and reverse it. I will show you how to do that shortly. So first, because I use the macros here, what I can do is I can turn this macro 8 to maximum, and then in the mod matrix I can have this act negatively. So now I think when the macro is at maximum, I would like a little less filter tracking on filter 1, so less of that high end comes through. So in the macro edit, my final slot, filter 1, I'm going to key track. So you can hear less key tracking, so the filter doesn't open quite as much at that end. So that's actually eight modulation sources all into this one macro, and only one mod slot using for it. So let's experiment a little with it. So very high up there. Let's play in a different key. Okay, I think that's pretty interesting. So while I would say the sound is not necessarily the most compelling sound I could have designed, I hope that it demonstrated a thought process behind how I approach designing it, and demonstrated some techniques that might be useful, in particular going back again to taking advantage of macros, not just for real-time controls using the encoders, but using them to control other modulations. Specifically, I find the touch mod strip to be much easier and quicker and more playable than turning encoders. So I would rather have it set up this way. And in fact, looking at one of the obvious contemporary synthesizers of this would be the Mini Freak. And one of the things that I like a lot about the Mini Freak is the touch strips can be configured to be 2 macro controls. And that's really what I like using the mod wheel for. So Yes, it is possible to use the pitch bend as a modulation source, but it's a little bit less convenient than using the mod wheel, and having pitch bend available also is convenient. So, I think that brings us to the end of what we are doing today. I've probably got another at least 2 or 3 of these sound design demonstrations to go through, an end-to-end sound design process. But for now, I think that is all that I wanted to talk about. So, all that remains to be said is thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you will join me for some more episodes in this series. But in any case, thank you again, and goodbye.